Thank you, Lee, and thank you all very much for your generosity and your kindness. Maggie and I have thoroughly enjoyed being here and relishing the Nova Scotia hospitality and getting to know some of you. It's been a great joy, and we look forward to seeing some of you when you come to the north of England. I know that you not perhaps all will make it that far north. When you visit, you'll probably just do the usual thing of London and Stratford and Oxford and Cambridge, and then you'll think that's done. But actually no, come further north and Durham is waiting for you. My theme tonight is the confrontation between the power of God and the powers of the world. And I want to bring that confrontation into sharp and dramatic focus by highlighting in particular the matchless scene towards the end of John's Gospel, where Jesus and Pontius Pilate confront one another, representing precisely the power of God and the power of the world. And this is the scene, incidentally but not unimportantly, in which ancient historians have regularly recognized historical verisimilitude. People often say, well, we're not quite sure about how much of the rest of John really is as historical as it might be, but this looks like what a Roman provincial trial of a suspect might well have been like. I was put in mind of this scene by a letter I received early last year. My correspondent noted that I had joined in the public criticism of our British Prime Minister Tony Blair for his support of the American action in Iraq. And my correspondent declared that while he actually agreed with me on the substantive issue, he thought I should not have impugned Mr. Blair's integrity in terms of his speech that he made in the House of Commons and so on. And my correspondent then went on to ask, and this is the point, granted that when Pilate asked Jesus, what is truth, Jesus didn't reply, does that mean that John, or even Jesus, is tacitly acknowledging that truth is merely subjective, so that one person's opinion on the deepest questions is always as good as another's? When Jesus gave no reply, did that mean there isn't an answer to what is truth? Now, to raise the questions of truth and power, which is what John's narrative does at this point, is to arrive at the center of some of the most pressing questions of our contemporary culture. The good news, though this may come as a surprise to some, is that the Bible is deeply interested in these questions, far more interested than many of its interpreters have been in the last couple of centuries. And it is with a sense of anticipation, therefore, that we launch into our theme of the new imperialism which has appeared within the postmodern world, and inquire whether there is anything particularly Christian or biblical to say about it. Certainly John would say that there is. In Johannine terms, Pontius Pilate represents the world which on the one hand was made through the Word of God, but the world which did not know that Word. Quoting, of course, from the prologue. The world into which the disciples were being sent. John 17, John 20. The world which was not, after all, the source of Jesus' kingdom, but which was indeed its goal. In other words, Jesus says, my kingdom is not from this world, but John has Jesus say, God so loved the world. The world is kind of ambiguous, therefore, in John. Well, not exactly ambiguous, just many-sided. And this love of God for the world and the sending of the Son to redeem the world is the point, of course, that the Gnostic can never understand, which is why Gnosticism cannot generate or sustain a biblical political theology. Which is why it was, despite a host of distractors, why it was the Orthodox and not the Gnostics who were thrown to the beasts and burnt at the stake in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. But to pursue that would take us too far afield, though it's an interesting point. The point I'm making here is simply this, that for John there is a constant tension throughout the world, throughout the Gospel, between the world as God's world, created and sustained and loved by God, and the world as simultaneously in rebellion against God, refusing to know him and his word, and even organizing itself in opposition to God and his word. And it is this tension which comes then to its climax and focus in the confrontation between Jesus and Pilate, the Word and the world, standing there facing one another. Now, I'm going to return to this in due course. Having indicated that that is my destination in this lecture, I must now advance my first and basic claim, which has to do with today's culture. I suggest that the postmodern climate in which we live, though it may appear outwardly hostile to the new types of imperialism which currently stalk our world, cannot in fact do more than raise an ineffectual protest against them and end up merely colluding with them. And this proposal will clear the way for my substantive argument, in parallel with the arguments that I've been advancing in the previous two lectures, that a fully biblical theology is capable of showing a different way forward through both the complaints of postmodernity and the boastings of the new imperialism, and the cultural minefield which includes them both, and on into new ways of addressing our global community life, for which, to be sure, we need the postmodern critique, lest we slide back into the now barren politics of modernity, but also something, a new impetus, that will take us out the other side and into positive reconstruction, bearing a Christian witness to truth in today's world of power. So my first claim is that the postmodern climate not only cannot effectively critique the new type of empire with which we're faced, but that it actually ends up by colluding with it. And for this we need to sort out some terms. What I mean here by empire and the new imperialism is the new phenomenon that has arisen in this last generation, where before empire meant broadly the sprawling system of rule by one country over other countries, with administration and government flowing from a single central source. Let me remember into colonies on this side of the Atlantic. Economic systems which achieve a similar financial and economic effect, but without the direct political, governmental and administrative control. In other words, though the United States does not directly govern, say, Peru on the one hand or Israel on the other, the way the global economic system is set up and run largely from within the United States means that the policies of Peru and the sheer economic existence of Israel are kept in place by Washington. The extent to which this kind of arrangement is properly described as empire is variously debated, and I'm not going to enter that debate tonight as to the appropriateness of the word. Just let the label stand for the moment, and let's note as well that in what follows I am not being anti-American any more than someone who criticizes the policies of Tony Blair is being anti-British. If we can't raise questions about particular policies of particular governments, we really are in deep trouble. Now, I've already sketched some meanings for the term postmodernity in the first lecture, but let me amplify it here to show its relation to empire. Postmodernity is basically a negative term, parasitic on modernity in its reality as well as its semantics, with modernity itself being parasitic on an older Christian, or at least semi-Christian, European culture. And the term postmodernity refers, of course, to the critique and abandonment of modernist culture, which included a view of God, a view of the world, and a view of the whole project to which the supposedly enlightened world of the 18th century was committed. Let's just sketch this worldview, a view of God, a view of the world, and a view of the project, in order then to see how postmodernity has offered alternatives, and then eventually to suggest some Christian ways of coming round the back and offering alternatives again. Modernity's triple worldview then. As for God, modernity tended towards deism, keeping heaven and earth well separated. And this position slides off easily into atheism. You know, God starts off as an absentee landlord and ends up just as an absentee. People run the world as though God doesn't exist, and then from Voltaire and others onwards, they actually say, well, of course, that's because he, in fact, doesn't exist. And within that world, spirituality, Christian faith included, was a private option with the emphasis on private, despite the continuance of an established church in England at least, and elsewhere, Scotland too. The de jure separation of church and state enjoyed, if that is the right word, by America, has been true de facto in most other Western countries as well. So with God kicked upstairs out of sight, modernity could develop a sharper and apparently more efficient view of the world, and indeed of one's own self. I am the master of my fate, the lonely enlightenment ego. That mirrored the self-made man of the Industrial Revolution, usually was a man, of course, carving out a destiny from a world which was there to be analyzed and exploited, developed, and if necessary, despoiled. Science within this worldview, as opposed to the earlier worldview of more devout writers like Newton, was a matter of humans discovering and learning facts. I forget who the author of the quote was, but it's rather nice, that facts, like telescopes and wigs for gentlemen, were an 18th century invention. Discovering and learning facts and then finding out how to exploit them for profit. Objective facts enabled industry to thrive, which enabled the self-made man to prosper, which enabled, so some believed in theory, a new standard of living to trickle down to everyone else. Plenty of people objected to this theory, of course. We might even hail Charles Dickens as a forerunner of postmodernity, with his scathing denunciation precisely of those for whom the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution seemed to have worked on behalf of those for whom it manifestly hadn't. But for many it did, and it's no part of my purpose today, even though some people sometimes imagine it is, to say that the Enlightenment was purely bad and dangerous and wrong-headed. Just as one obvious example, I have no desire whatever to be operated on by a pre-modern, let alone a postmodern surgeon or dentist. Give me the accuracy and the attention to detail and the technology of high modernity any day, thank you very much. Nor am I out of sympathy with the cultural flowering of the Enlightenment. A close friend told me the other day, and I was rather flattered, that the encyclopedists would have approved of my historical method even though they wouldn't have liked my conclusions. And my postmodern instincts are not nearly strong enough to make me reject Mozart or Beethoven or Schubert. I find Shelley's poems appealing even when I reject his theology, though I confess I find Tennyson at his dullest when he is most in tune with the 19th century mood I just described. The bright light shed by modernity on the self and on the facts about the objective world is in fact overbright, borrowing extra brightness from that which it ignores and without at the time paying the cost, though the bills mounted up. This becomes evident when we look at the third element of modernity, namely the story of progress. This narrative is so deeply embedded within our culture that even now, with postmodernity rampant, one constantly hears it said, now that we live in the modern world, ... and we all know what the speaker means. We are all signed up, so it is assumed, to a view of world history in which things are in fact getting better and better all the time. So that side by side with scientific advances, which are always assumed to be beneficial, there stride political improvements, social amelioration, fresh moral judgments, which are always more enlightened, more universally beneficial than what has gone before. So that any attempt to question them and to insist that some of the old standards were actually better than what we're doing is seen as almost insane or even today criminal. World history, it seems, came out of the tunnel and into the light with the great social and scientific and cultural and political revolutions of the 18th century. And what remains now is to implement that achievement, to work out in the continuing story of post-Enlightenment progress what was implicit in the arrival of Western culture into that which we call modernity. The extent to which this modernist doctrine of progress is a parody of Christian eschatology is a fascinating topic, but for another time. Though I can't resist just the footnote that one of the main reasons in the last 200 years why people have insisted that we know the resurrection of Jesus can't have happened is that if the resurrection of Jesus did happen, that must be the moment when world history reached its climax. But the Enlightenment thinks that world history reached its climax with the philosophy and cultural advances of the 18th century. So there's a kind of a clash of eschatologies driving the pseudo-scientific rejection of resurrection. Think about it. Now, within modernity thus conceived, the project of empire is not just a possibility but an obligation. If we are the enlightened ones, we have a duty to share that enlightenment with the rest of the human race. With the happy result, which of course nobody intended at the time, that as our enlightened culture flowed out to them, their riches would flow back to us. For many of the classic Enlightenment theories, I think of Malthus, a social Darwinian before Darwin himself, there was a determinist edge to this. Improvement is bound to come. Colonial expansion is merely an outworking of the survival of the fittest, who just happen, of course, to believe in freedom, justice and peace and all those other wonderful things that empires always claim to possess. And within this, following Rousseau and Voltaire and others, new theories of statehood emerged in which the general public were at last to be permitted a say. And once everyone has the right to vote, they genuinely believed utopia would be achieved. The failure of utopia to arrive on schedule after 200 years goes a long way to explaining the sad look on the face of some French politicians today. Just as the American belief that utopia has arrived and now needs to be defended and extended whether people want it or not, helps to explain the steely smiles of some of their North American counterparts. The English, of course, and I think to a considerable extent our Canadian cousins, tend at this point to play the usual game of looking puzzledly in both directions and wondering what's going on. But the 20th century has called all that into question, that whole modernist project and the legitimation of empire which it has sustained. And anyone who doesn't see this calling into question, and who imagines that the modernist rhetoric can continue unabated after the Somme, the Depression, Auschwitz, the Gulag, Hiroshima, Vietnam, Rwanda, Bosnia, 9/11, and now Iraq, Darfur, Afghanistan, Lebanon, Gaza, you fill in other blanks. Anyone who can't see this seems to be living in a culpably blind time warp. We simply cannot explain these modernist delights in terms of some people not being quite enlightened enough. Several of the horrors were quite specifically Enlightenment driven. For instance, the rampant social Darwinism that led both Britain and Germany cheerfully to embrace the First World War. You know, there were people preaching sermons in St. Paul's Cathedral talking about eugenics and how we had to fight these wars because it meant that the race would get fitter, because once we discovered who was better at fighting, those were the ones who would survive. Of course, machine guns make total nonsense of social Darwinism at that point. And when you think of the energetic Hegelian culture Protestantismus that encouraged the German Christians to support Hitler, you know, there's all sorts of things going on. The Enlightenment was by no means an unmixed blessing. But the whole of the last century ought to serve for us, and this is of course highlighted by September the 11th, 2001, as a kind of Tower of Babel phenomenon. This is where the human race ought to recognize that pride has brought about a long and terrible fall. The Achilles heel of modernism, in short, is the continuing fact of evil. Evil has not been abolished by Act of Parliament, or by the steady determinist rise of the human spirit, or by the upward movement of socio-cultural dialectic. Humans are still the same glorious and horrible creatures that we always were, and to pretend otherwise is just blind arrogance. And the fact of evil, which hits us in the face with every fresh atrocity, always comes as a shock to modernity. We thought we'd banished that stuff, which is why, as I said earlier this week, modernist politicians react to evil in such an immature fashion. Evil? Let's just go and drop some bombs on it, and then it'll be all right, won't it? It is against this entire modernist project that postmodernity has, quite rightly in my view, launched its critique. Somebody was worried last night that I was being a bit rude about postmodern deconstruction projects, and this is where they get their day in the sun, as it were. How does the critique run? Well, God, the world, the self, the project. As for God, postmodern thinkers tend to begin from an assumed and sometimes cynical atheism, but theology, like nature, abhors a vacuum, which is why we've witnessed in the contemporary world lots of forms of neo-pantheism and neo-gnosticism emerging in the last couple of decades. Spirituality is suddenly in vogue after the long winter of secularism. But it's often a pick-and-mix spirituality which easily collapses into self-help therapies and, more explicitly, pagan practices and patterns. And if God remains a nebulous quantity, the world is more mysterious than within modernism, but also more chaotic. And the lonely I, the great ego, has been deconstructed. I'm not sure quite who I am, after all. And those wonderful objective facts that enable people to go charging around the world making rather a lot of money have turned into a mirage, since all truth claims have been unmasked as power claims, so that all truth is someone's truth, usually with strings, not least purse strings, attached. And in particular, there is no big story. The death of the meta-narrative is one of the most central and obvious features of postmodernity, with the Enlightenment story of progress and upward development being the principal target of that critique. but with all sorts of other targets, not least religious ones, coming along as well. Now, I regard all of this as a thoroughly necessary reaction to modernity. Indeed, I regard the postmodern turn as the secular equivalent of the preaching of the doctrine of original sin. Modernity thought that it had banished evil from the face of the earth. Postmodernity says there is this thing called the fall. We're all in it. So it's natural that postmodernity would turn its critical eye too on the project of empire, as witnessed the entire movement we know as post-colonialism. Empire was part of the Enlightenment project. It was much older than that, of course. People have been having empires since the world began. But the particular form and driving motive of the 19th century empires was very characteristically Enlightenment. And postmodernity pointed the finger. Empire was all about money, sex and power. Marx, Freud and Nietzsche. And that's the point behind all those television programs about the Raj. I don't know if you've had them over here, we've had plenty in England. Though the point was already actually seen by Kipling a century ago, and by E.M. Forster 60 years ago, and by many others. But the point, and this is the central point of this first section of the lecture, is that the postmodern critique doesn't work. This is the argument of that remarkable book by Nicholas Boyle, professor of German in Cambridge, a book called Who Are We Now? From Hegel to Heine. Who are we now? Nicholas Boyle, B-O-Y-L-E. To put it crudely, all those years of Lyotard, Derrida and Foucault, and we still got George W. Bush. The postmodern critique can sneer and scoff. Like the ancient cynics, it can bark quite loudly. It can point out that the new style of emperor has no more clothes on than the old ones did. The postmodern critique can analyse, as does Michael Moore in those bizarre films and books, the inner workings of the political elite and show up their self-serving and often breathtakingly shameless manipulation of everything from votes to vetoes, from the economy to the environment and from war to religion. But postmodernity seems not, as a matter of, dare I say, fact, to be able to prevent the empire from going on in its sweet way. Just as Diogenes and his ilk could scoff at Alexander the Great and Augustus and Tiberius and their successors, but couldn't stop the empire rolling forwards, so the postmodern thinkers haven't been able to prevent the massive rise in global debt, the dangerous increase in global warming, or the monstrous wall in Palestine, or the fact that the Israeli apologists insist on calling it a fence. What is more, and we're getting back to Pontius Pilate in just a moment, empire characteristically co-opts postmodernity to serve its own ends. When it suits it, the empire plays at modernity. Here are the facts. We run the world. We know the way things are. You better watch out. But when it suits it, it plays at postmodernity. If the statistics aren't favourable, we'll spin them. We'll release them on a bad news day so that nobody notices. And we will smear our opponents so that their critique, whether valid or not, can't get off the ground. What is truth? Said Pilate. That question serves, as cynicism often does, to shrug its shoulders at any challenge to absolute power. Empire is, in fact, from this point of view, necessarily postmodern as well as modern. Facts are useful when they support us, but when they don't, we'll toss them aside with a sneer about the impossibility of truth claims. Now, it would be possible to take quite a long time and spell all this out in terms of where we are today. I pass over the economic stranglehold exercised by the West over the rest, the manipulation of other people's misery in the Middle East for short-term gains, political and economic at home, the use of war and violence as a business opportunity, the disregard for international law and convention and protocols, the dangerously cavalier treatment of the global ecosystem. Within modernism, by the way, that isn't simply because we want to make money out of cutting down rainforests and building pipelines across virgin territory, but because within modernity we are the masters. We run this show. So we have the right and perhaps even the obligation to show our mastery. There is a wondrous irony about the way in which those who are solidly opposed to the teaching of Darwin in classes about the origins of the world are relentlessly Darwinian when it comes to the survival of the fittest in socio-economic and military terms. All these are danger signs indeed, signals from within the world of global empire that when postmodernity stands in front of the imperial tank waving a red flag, all that happens is that the tank commander commandeers the red flag to signal to the other tanks to move forwards. It's within this dangerous and confused social, cultural and political context that we urgently need to recover a sense of a biblical and Christian viewpoint on empire and all that goes with it. And that's the task I turn to in the second part of this lecture. T.S. Eliot's Ash Wednesday, against the word, the unstilled world still whirled. It's hard to say that so that you can see what's on the page. Against the word, the unstilled world still whirled. We return to John 18 and John 19. John's Gospel is reaching its climax here after the extraordinary discourses of chapters 13 to 17, which climax in Jesus' prayer for his followers. The narrative resumes where it left off in chapter 12, though now carrying all the theological freight of what has gone on in between. The older I get and the more I read John, the more I am fascinated with the way the structure of the Gospel works. It's not an accident that you suddenly stop in 12 and get 13 through 17 before you are able to understand what's happening with Jesus and Pilate. We read these chapters, in other words, knowing not least from chapter 13 that they are all about Jesus loving his own to the uttermost, and from chapter 16 that this is what it looks like when the ruler of this world faces judgment. And about those two, the love and the judgment, coming together in a series of explosive paradoxes, leading both to the cry of final accomplishment on the cross, tetelestai, it's completed, and to the new creation that bursts out 3 days later. The idea, incidentally, which I read just recently somewhere, I happily forget where, that John might be relativized because he's writing after AD 70 and hence has a more accommodating approach to Rome, is ludicrous when you consider the role of this scene, 18 and 19, within that word-world confrontation that's been going on all through the Gospel. Not to mention the fact that Christians after AD 70 were hardly less likely to be in confrontation with the empire than before. People say these odd things. Just like, this is a pure aside, in my what I suppose is my primary field, Paul, people often now say, yes, the real Paul has this wonderful anti-imperial stuff in Romans and Philippians and Thessalonians and so on, and that's true, he does. And then they say, but when we turn to Ephesians and Colossians, we find somebody who is just colluding with empire and is settling down and becoming socially conformist and comfortable. It's absolute rubbish. It's in Colossians that we find that the principalities and powers have been led as a defeated rabble behind Jesus' cross. And it's in Ephesians that the fact of the multicultural church declares to the principalities and powers that their time is up. There's an awful lot of odd things going on in the world of New Testament scholarship at the moment. Anyway, perhaps the most important starting point in John 18 is the regular mistranslation of verse 36, He basileamu ukestin ektu kosmu tutu. This does not mean, as one hears so often, as it says in many popular translations, my kingdom is not of this world. People routinely quote this back at me when I'm talking about the kingdom, as though what Jesus was saying is that he has a totally otherworldly kingdom, so that there's really no conflict between him and Pilate. Pilate thinks about this earth and Jesus is thinking away in heaven somewhere. No, that's not what it is. We must give the ek its full force. My kingdom is not out of or from this world. In other words, it is not generated from within this world. If it were, as Jesus explains, his servants would fight to keep him from being handed over to the Judean authorities. That is what this worldly kingdoms always do. That's how they attain power and then maintain it. Jesus is not denying that he's a king. He's not denying that his kingdom is for this world. He is denying something which Pilate would assume, as so many would assume about the nature of his kingdom, that it's the standard revolutionary type of thing, seeking to win an earthly kingdom by earthly means. No, Jesus' kingdom is not from this world. But boy, is it for this world. And the fact that people have ignored that is another reason why they've imagined that John isn't interested in resurrection. Jesus is here, in fact, saying much the same as he said to James and John in Mark 10:35 to 45. James and John, you remember, were expecting Jesus to become king in a fairly ordinary sense, and they wanted to sit on either side of him as he exercised his authority. They were perhaps making a bid to upstage Peter and Andrew. Who knows? Jesus' answer, which climaxes in the famous reference to Daniel 7 and Isaiah 53, Son of Man came not to be served but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus' answer is all about the nature of power. And that might serve as a heading for John's scene of the trial before Pilate. The rulers of this earth lord it over their subjects, and their great ones exercise dominion over them. But it's not going to be like that with you. With you, anyone who wants to be great must be your servant. The first must be your slave. This passage, Mark 10:35 to 45, is about power before it is about atonement. More precisely, it is about the nature of power, and particularly the nature of empire, the kingdoms of the world and the kingdom of God. For Mark, as for John, and indeed I believe for Paul, the way to discover the meaning of the cross involves going through that confrontation between the powers of the world and the power of God. And in Mark, as in John and in Paul, power is being redefined because kingship is being redefined, of course, around Jesus himself. To move back to John 18, for Pilate, Jesus' kingship makes no sense. Jesus says it's about witnessing to the truth. Verse 13 is explicit and detailed. Jesus' kingship is about witnessing to the truth because Jesus, alone of all kings, can and does take a God's eye view of the world, which is the view of grieving, self-giving love, through which alone the reality of the world can be perceived, over against the perspectives of all human power systems. Pilate's categories simply can't cope with that proposal. So his answer, what is truth, signals the fact that the only truth he really knows is Caesar's truth, the truth that comes out of the scabbard of a sword, or as we would say, out of the barrel of a gun. It is the truth of whips and nails and crosses, the truth that will swap Jesus for a brigand if that's what the crowd wants, the truth that lets Pilate wriggle off one hook while impaling Jesus on another. It is the truth of death. And John intends to show us that the Creator God knows and is about to enact a deeper truth even than that. This moves us into John 19, where the scene develops by several further earth-shaking moves. The soldiers' fake saluting of Jesus, "Hail, King of the Jews," is heavily ironic, of course, as is the "Behold the man" of verse 5. This is the man, John is saying. This is what it looks like when the Word becomes flesh. On the 6th day of the week, human beings were created in God's image. And now, on a Friday, here is this image, bleeding, bruised, wearing a crown of thorns, redefining power in his silent suffering, launching a critique of the world's empires, the world's ways of power, sharper than all other critiques put together. And it's in that context precisely that Jesus and Pilate have their conversation about power. "Don't you know," says Pilate, "that I have the power to crucify you and the power to release you?" Jesus says, "You could have no power over me unless it were given you from above. So the one who handed me over has the greater sin." And that exchange, you see, embodies a genuine first-century Jewish view of earthly power. The classic Jewish critique of the world's ways of power and empire does not imply a simple anarchy. It isn't that the world's powers just have to be abolished and then all will be well. As the rabbis might have said, God wants there to be authorities to keep the peace, to run the world, because otherwise the bullies and the wicked and the powerful and the arrogant will always win. But if God wants there to be authorities, they've got to be chosen from within a world which is itself deeply flawed. So as soon as you give any human being the role of being in authority, even in the role of, say, a peacekeeper, let alone a justice bringer, you hand them the temptation to abuse that position, to become part of the problem rather than part of the solution. That is the paradox of human rule, that it is necessary under the Creator God, but granted the present state of the world, it always constitutes a dangerous temptation. And the reason why Paul insisted that the powers are to be answerable to the Creator God, not to themselves, lies precisely there. Romans 13 is not a way of saying, oh, the powers that be, they're fine, so you just have to do what they say. He says the powers that be are created, called into existence by God, and they're ultimately answerable to him. Pilate is ignorant of that point. He was answerable to Tiberius Caesar, son of the divine Augustus. And his position was defined and sustained precisely in relation not only to Tiberius the man, but to the entire imperial system and its religious legitimation of that self-defining and self-justifying rule. And the breathtaking move then in the narrative is that the Jewish leaders acquiesce in Pilate's self-definition, and indeed threaten him into sticking with it when he looks like wobbling. If you let this man go, you're not Caesar's friend. Anyone who makes himself a king speaks against Caesar. Pilate says, shall I crucify your king? We have no king, they shout back, except Caesar. And with that, it isn't only Jesus' fate that is sealed, but also that of the Jewish leaders. Though John has no equivalent of the Markan discourse against the temple, apart from the hint in chapter 2, what we have witnessed is not merely the cynical manipulation of imperial justice to eliminate a troublemaker, but the deep-level perversion of the call of Israel to be the people of the Creator God, to have no king but God alone. And instead, not merely, as they said to Samuel, to demand a king like all the nations, Kakol HaGoyim, but to place themselves under the one who was the king of all the other nations. The Jewish leaders thus secularize themselves at exactly the same moment as, from John's perspective, their rightful king is shown up in his true colours as the king whose kingdom is not from this world, but is all the more certainly for this world. And this is the point at which the two puzzles of the prologue come together. The world was made by him, yet the world knew him not. He came to his own, and his own received him not. More echoes of T.S. Eliot's Ash Wednesday. O my people, what have I done unto thee? John's stark contrast not only of two kings, but of two utterly different types of kingship, thus lies at the heart of the New Testament's theological analysis of politics and the gospel. Caesar's kingship, in which truth is relative to power, a kingship precisely from this world, and therefore ultimately a kingship rooted in idolatry, and therefore a kingdom based on lies, on deception, on the disguise of naked power behind grandiose language. Freedom, justice, salvation, and peace being the usual suspects in Rome as today. That kingdom stands over against Jesus' kingship, founded on the truth which is God's truth, and committed to speaking that truth to power, whatever the cost. And in that vision of the alternative kingdom, as John has declared throughout his gospel, and now emphasizes with the sharpest possible paradox, we behold his glory, glory as of the only Son of the Father, full of grace and truth. All that I said yesterday about glory in terms of the filling of the temple and the present and future fillings of the whole earth. All that I said about glory in terms of a revived Christian aesthetic awareness and possibility now stands before us in the human form of Jesus, utterly vulnerable, utterly human, carrying God's kingdom project for the world all the way to the cross, which is the final word that Caesar's kingdom can utter, and which is shown up in its false claim to be the last possible word by the resurrection. What is truth? Here it is, says John, truth incarnate, truth crucified and risen, truth now ready to take on the world, not with the love of power, but with the power of love. No wonder Jesus couldn't reply when Pilate said, what is truth? Pilate was probably not up for the kind of theological discourse he would have needed to get. And actually the answer was in the life and the death and the resurrection itself. From this point, there is a straight line into vital reflections on our present situation. Were there more time, it would be possible to show a similar analysis of Caesar's power in the writings of Paul, but for that I must simply refer you to my published work on the subject, particularly chapter 4 of my recent book, Paul in Fresh Perspective. Many writers have said similar things about Revelation. It's now quite common coin in the study of Revelation to see the critique of the Roman Empire, and indeed Matthew, Hebrews, 1 Peter, and so forth. The early Christian perspective draws on an entire train of thought from the Old Testament. It's extraordinary to me that I grew up in Bible reading circles, in Bible studying circles, and did a lot of energetic reading of scriptures with a lot of good friends and in different contexts, and we never really thought about the political theology of the Old Testament all that much. Maybe the Baptists among you managed to do that, but we Anglicans didn't. The confrontation between the creator and the pagan power begins at least, well, maybe it's earlier than this, but I was thinking of the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11, followed by the call of Abraham. Here is human arrogance, human empire, and here is this strange nomad, somebody of no fixed abode, who doesn't go about building towers, but lives in tents. And then you get Moses standing before Pharaoh, and then you get David against the Philistines, and then with a deep ambiguity as the monarchy always tries to turn itself into a human empire and finally discovers if you want to play the game that way, there are some real human empires out there and they won't like it. And hence the exile. But then from within the exile there grow the towering writings of 2nd Isaiah and Daniel, which bring into sharp and repeated focus the direct conflict between the kingdoms of the world and the kingdom of the God who made the world and is going to renew the world, renew creation. And these themes are then variously expanded in the various post-biblical Jewish writings, not least importantly the Wisdom of Solomon, very interesting as a moment in Second Temple Jewish reflection on theology and politics. I could happily give a whole lecture on, in fact more than one, on all of that stuff, but I just hint it for you today. When we read the New Testament within this overall setting, we find that the story it tells of Jesus and his kingdom proclamation and his death and resurrection is the strange and unexpected but utterly appropriate climax of a larger narrative, a political narrative no less than a theological one, about the sovereign purposes of the Creator God for his whole creation. Purposes which result in the ultimate exodus, the real return from exile, the launching of nothing short of new creation, which will be, as in Isaiah, a fresh world of justice and peace. This, it appears, is the reality which the gospel of Jesus promises. And as I said before, just as the Enlightenment's great narrative of world history reaching its climax in the Western world of the 18th century is a thoroughgoing parody of the